Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Joining me tonight is Ben Kinsley, who's our co-host and co-producer, and our special guest this evening, which is one of Ben's favorite topics, is Matt Kropp, co-executive director of the Full Barrel Cooperative Brewery and Taproom. Welcome, Matt. Glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Matt, thanks for being here.
I was just telling Matt before the show that somehow over the last 2.5 years, every show we do, somehow the word beer and craft beer comes up. That seems to be our common theme.
Happy to be able to help keep the streak alive.
Yes, exactly.
It's a big thing.
Well, we've been joking for a while. Like, we have to do a show on craft beer because we talk about it all the time.
I've asked the association, this is the second show I've mentioned you, to come on the show, but I haven't been successful yet, but I'm going to keep working.
Keep working on it.
I'm keeping working on it. Anyway, we ask our guests to tell a little bit about themselves, so jump right in.
Yep. So my day job is I work for the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, where we help business owners who are interested in selling their businesses to their employees figure out how to do that. And they do that through either kind of usually the employee stock ownership plan model or the worker cooperative model. And I'm generally an enthusiast for cooperative ownership, alternative kind of ownership forms. I kind of first got into the model years ago, learning about credit unions, and sort of went down a rabbit hole on that front.
Yep.
I ended up getting my master's in history, studying the Vermont State Employees Credit Union for my thesis. And so,
do they know that?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
I spent some time in there in the back room, going through board meeting minutes from the 1950s.
Oh, how neat!
So that kind of like led me down the rabbit hole of really finding cooperatives interesting, and I learned maybe 5 years ago about Black Star, which is the very first kind of consumer-owned cooperative brewery in the United States that was founded in Austin, Texas.
Oh,
and
right.
That was
I think I told you, I found a
this.
huge article on that brewery, and it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I actually read it. So, but tell Ben where else there are in Boston. There's two in Boston.
Yep. So I actually just got back from a little road trip with for we're trying to start a cooperative brewery, Full Barrel, here in Vermont, so in Burlington. And myself and two of the other board members went on a road trip over the weekend to visit the 3 co-op breweries that are currently in Massachusetts. So, did a little loop where we hit Artisan Beverage Cooperative in Greenfield, and then 3 Cross in Worcester, and then ended up at Democracy Brewing, which is right off the Boston Common in Boston. And then
cool.
And then spent the night in Boston, and then came home in the morning.
Yeah, that sounds like like quite the fun trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's cool. So, well, I guess, could you mentioned too ESOP, which I actually know from the Merchants Bank when I worked there, and this. What are the difference between the two of them?
Yeah, so these are the two. So with the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, we really focus on broad-based employee ownership, which we define as something that allows every full-time employee to have a path to becoming a co-owner of a business.
Right.
And so the ESOP is essentially, it's a retirement plan that owns the company on behalf of the employees. So every year you work there, you receive some ownership as a benefit.
That's right.
The worker co-op is a more direct form of ownership, in that every employee, after they spend a certain amount of time working there, purchases a share of the business, and everyone owns 1 share. And then profits are distributed on the basis of either the hours worked or W-2 income or some combination thereof. So it's kind of like a bonus at the end of the year. The profits are distributed out amongst the employee owners. And in that case, the employees actually everyone has 1 vote for the board of directors. And so you have this, kind of a democratic governance structure for the company. Oftentimes management is still fairly conventional. So you still have a manager who can hire and fire and do all that, but they're accountable to a board that represents the sort of the group of employees.
Interesting.
And so two of the breweries that we visited when we were in Massachusetts were organized on that model, and then one of them was a hybrid where half of it was owned by the customers and half of it was owned by the employees, which is the first one that I'm aware of that's experimenting with that hybrid model. So that was very interesting to me.
Because that's kind of what a credit union is. It's really owned by the customers, not really the employees.
Exactly.
Right?
Credit union or a food co-op. So when you're thinking about co-ops, it's you think about what's the stakeholder group that owns the business. And so for a worker co-op, it's the employees. For a consumer co-op, it's the customers. And for like a producer co-op like Cabot, It's the folks who sell their product through the thing. So in that case, it's the farmers.
Oh, it's interesting to think about. So Agrimark is basically the holding company that
exactly
that the farmers are a member of.
So the farmers own Agrimark, and then basically they get if there's a profit, it's returned to the farmers prorated by how much milk they sold through the company.
Gotcha. So Cabot makes a profit, Agrimark makes a profit, the farmers make a profit.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Can people buy more than one share?
So this kind of gets into some of the interesting bits of the finance, but usually it's set up so that you can only own one voting share.
Oh.
And then if you want to invest more, the co-op, if it needs additional capital, it can issue non-voting preferred shares.
Oh, okay, so
it'll pay like a dividend.
Yeah.
But that one member, one vote kind of principle is one of the cores of the cooperative model.
Gotcha.
It's
so you can
democratic.
buy more shares, but you just can't buy more votes.
Right. And
I like that.
And the other thing is that the way that, and this is kind of, again, it's different depending on the type of co-op, but the way in which the profit is distributed is at its core that voting share is what entitles you to what's called like the patronage refund. So at like say a food co-op, a consumer co-op, they keep track of how much you spend, and at the end of the year, if they say had a 5% rate of profit, you get 5%. That your share of that 5% back based on how much you spent, not how many shares you own.
I think that's what the food co-op here in Montpelier does.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
And so for a worker co-op, then it's the same principle, but it's the amount of labor you contributed. Or for something like Agrimark, it's the amount of milk you put through. So,
right. So it's your dividend is prorated based on your.
So if a co-op has no outside obligations, any profit it makes is returned to its members prorated by how much they use the co-op. And if it needs additional outside capital, then it takes on loans or gets that non-voting preferred shares. But ultimately, its goal is to eventually eliminate those outside obligations and operate on that not-for-profit basis.
What fun.
Yeah, so it's an interesting model. I know I've spoken with a few folks about it at the VEOC in the past, and I think it's an interesting thing. The difficult part, obviously, is making the jump from being an LLC or a corporate model to doing that, and that's getting over that initial hurdle of
that sort of access to capital.
The access to capital to sell the business back to the employees. One question I do have on the ESOP model, because it's basically a retirement fund that's funded through ownership of the business. Are those retirement funds diversified over other, like a 401k or something else that can balance risk?
So that's a good question, and there's a few pieces to it. One is that a lot of the companies will both have an ESOP plan and then also a diversified plan.
Gotcha.
And then there's rules around around sort of age. At certain ages, you're allowed to start diversifying what's in your ESOP. So it's like once you hit, I think, 56, you can take 25% of that and put it in index funds, and then once you hit 60, that goes up to 50%. So there's different ways of kind of for folks to manage that risk.
Right.
But there's also sort of, the flip side of that is the idea with employee-owned companies of, okay, so you do have some skin in the game, and therefore, if combined with good things like open book management and other participatory management techniques, it's shown to really sort of improve company performance, because if you can get a culture where everyone's rowing in the same direction and they can see how they can impact the bottom line, then at the end of the year when the share price is determined by evaluator, you can see the ways that you can influence that in a positive
when I left the
direction.
Merchants Bank, I not only had shares of stock that I was given because I had earned it, but also got a monthly payment out of the pension plan. So it's like, good deal.
Good deal.
Good deal is right. So tell me, if a company doesn't have any heirs to turn the company over when we're ready to retire, and who calls the management calls you, or employees call you, or both? How does it get started, and what happens?
I'd say most often it's the business owner, right? So they're starting to think about succession, trying to figure out what they're going to do. That family business question is often a big one, because it's like, okay, I got this from my parents, they got that from 3 or 4 generations, and
no
one wants to do it.
Exactly.
So the employees can often, from a legacy perspective, really be an attractive alternative. So oftentimes it's, they come, have an individual conversation, or we do some seminars around the state for folks to explore a little bit more deeply. If it's really interesting, usually then it's like, okay, let's do a feasibility study. Let's see if let's see if the numbers would work, if this is something that can be financed, and if
Right.
so, what kind of financing is needed. And if it looks financially feasible, then moving forward to.
And you take them all through this, all the paperwork, all the whatever has to happen to.
So our organization, it depends on the situation. So for the bigger companies with ESOPs, there's a fairly well-developed professional infrastructure around advising them, and it's because it's connected to a retirement plan. It's pretty highly technical. So you want to have
Right.
lawyers and
Right. Can't
trustees
escape
and
them, right?
So usually we're kind of on the front end of like education about it, and if they're really interested, then
I
they go
see.
and find the professionals. For the smaller companies where ESOPs, because they have all of that compliance stuff, there's kind of a floor of size under which the compliance costs outweigh any like tax benefits and other things. So those are the ones who more often we'll see as interested in the worker cooperatives, which are don't have any of that overhead, but also sort of there's a lot less of that professional infrastructure. So we'll do some more hand holding and technical assistance sort of through the whole process.
Must be a scary thing for the employees to.
It can be.
I would think I need a lot of educating and understanding.
Yeah, there's
before I
definitely,
jumped in.
usually there's at least a 6-month period of, you form a steering committee of the people who are really interested, and you kind of have a curriculum that's about both building business literacy and building kind of trust and group decision-making skills, and it's definitely there's this preparatory phase, and there's still ongoing education that needs to happen for people to have both that owner hat as well as the employee hat.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting incentive structure for sure, and I know I have friends and folks that I talk to that are in employee-owned businesses. And how many are there in Vermont? Do we know at this point?
There's about 50,
About 50?
Depending on how you define it. But so it's a little over 30 ESOP companies, and then I know there's 17 worker co-ops because we had an intern do a survey of them, and so we have the exact number there.
Right.
But with the ESOPs, it gets a little fuzzy because there's some kind of companies that are ESOP companies, but they're not headquartered here, and so there's somewhere it's like, does that count as a Vermont company? Right.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Can we count this one? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Interesting.
I think we asked the next question. I think you've answered that about the difference between ESOP and cooperative. So why don't you take the next question, Ben?
Sure. So it sounds like obviously you're a big fan of co-ops. You're also chair of the Vermont Solidarity Investing Club. Can you explain that a little bit? What that's about?
So this in some ways kind of came out of some experiences with cooperative development, because especially with the sort of, I'd say, a lot of the reason why at the VEOC really focus on conversions is that you've already got a healthy, well-functioning business that's got profit, and really it's a demographic question of the owner needs to exit, and then a co-op can be the sort of replacement. Starting a co-op is a much more sort of arduous long-term task, because it's an entrepreneurial effort. And so one of the things that kind of came up, and not just with the Full Barrel project, but some other startup co-ops that over time, oftentimes, especially with those consumer-owned ones, where it's a bunch of people who would like to be customers of a co-op, maybe put in their $100 or their $200 to buy their share, but then it takes a few years to recruit enough members and find a space and do all of that, and time can start to become a little bit of a liability, right? You sort of can lose momentum. They want to see progress, and so we learned about so the idea was, okay, how do we start building a pool of capital that can then support these kinds of projects from the people who are interested in them. And so we learned about a group in Minneapolis that had formed an investment club that was specifically dedicated to investing in cooperatives.
Oh.
And so investment clubs under kind of American securities law have this little carve out where basically if it's no more than 100 members, no member owns more than a quarter of it, and no one is being paid to make decisions. Everyone sort of who's a member of the club participates in the decision-making process. It sort of has this exemption and exists outside of the normal kind of investment company rules that the SEC and others cover, right? So basically, we created a club where a bunch of members all, in our club it's contribute or invest, it's an LLC partnership, invest between $20 and $200 a month, and then we vote on where, we kind of keep an eye on what co-ops are sort of needing capital, and then we vote on where to sort of invest that capital every quarter.
Oh.
And so the club now has a little over $20,000 in it. So not huge, but we've got 24 members now, and so we've invested in the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a loan fund. We've invested in the City Markets expansion in Burlington.
Yep.
Should look at Barry. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member there, and what's the word? Languishing. That's the word.
Well, that's in
It's
many
just-
ways like
yeah.
why that sort of situation is totally why we
Yeah,
created something
I
like this,
agree
because
with
now
you.
it's like every month, we see there's another $1,100 or $1,200 in the pot that we could
Right.
put to things, versus
Right.
saying like, okay, now it's been 4 years and we're still kind of like at the same level
Yep.
we've been at before, or something
Wow.
like that.
Yeah, because I've joined. I was one of the first members to join because
Mhm.
I really think Barry needs a food co-op like we have in Montpelier,
Mhm.
and put my $100 down, and it was moving, and all of a sudden, you don't hear much, and
Mhm.
you're losing a little interest or worried about what's going to happen.
I mean, that's something that with the Full Barrel project, we've definitely had ups and downs. And part of it's always the challenge of having a project that has lots of volunteers, because
Right.
different levels of volunteer energy go up and down over
Sure.
time, right?
Well, you
Someone
need a lot
who's-
of skill sets, right,
Mhm.
at different levels. Right.
And then sometimes then it's like, oh, we're doing the outreach. It's very public and everyone's sort of aware.
Yeah.
And then with a limited amount of volunteer energy, everyone's like, okay, now we need to focus on the business plan and that sort of like quiet, not
right.
as visible internal work.
Right.
Which can then feel like, from the outside, if you're not communicating that that's happening well,
Yeah,
then
we're
people are like,
wondering
oh,
what's going on.
Yeah, what's going on,
exactly.
yeah.
So that communication is always really important in that kind of development work.
It's interesting. It's I think we've seen that a lot with any type of community engagement business, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Where
Right.
you start working on some of those internal, like actually doing some of the work as opposed to communicating the message, right?
Mhm.
There's
and-
just so many of those communicating message meetings you can have
Right.
before people start going,
Right,
I know,
exactly.
but where's the co-op?
But
So-
Right.
where's the co-op? Yeah,
Where's the-
exactly.
where's the
but
meat?
there's some great success stories too. You talked about City Market, which is a huge success story.
Yep, just opened its second store.
Just opened a second
Oh,
store.
I didn't know that. Where's
Mhm.
that?
Off of Flynn Avenue in the south end of Burlington.
Oh,
Yeah,
terrific.
my neck of the woods.
Yeah, your neck of the woods. There you go.
That's a great success story. We have Agrimark, another great success story. And it seems like I think Chroma Technologies is another one that's
Yeah,
employee-owned.
they're employee owned. They're an interesting one. They're not an ESOP or a co-op. They have this kind of like almost like custom designed form of employee ownership. They
Yeah.
like kind of created themselves out of a C corporation, which is really cool.
Yeah, it was
But
interesting.
They're a very interesting company.
Yeah. There's a couple medical providers that are employee-owned businesses. So
Yeah, one of the biggest worker co-ops in the state is PT360,
Yep.
which does physical therapy.
Oh, right.
Yep.
Yeah, and they were an interesting one where they now have 3 locations. But
yeah,
you know,
and they're growing, and I think they're about to open a 4th location too. So
Excellent.
yeah, it's
So
it's
what
cool
is the
stuff.
Full Barrel Cooperative? That's such a long. Full Barrel Cooperative Brewery and Tavern. What is the vision?
that is our legal name.
Yeah,
but
what
yes.
is the vision? What's it all about?
Yeah, so it was basically inspired by, I was interested in cooperatives and all that, and learned about this member-owned co-op brewery
Right.
in Austin, Texas called Black Star.
Right.
And I thought I love craft beer. I'm not going to deny that. And so the
We do
idea
too.
of a beer co-op was just like, oh, like members of the community can kind of own it, and it's so the space is kind of
Right,
all of ours.
right.
And, having it be that sort of community third
Cool.
place that you could go to get a pint and not have your wallet totally emptied out either.
Right.
And so it really sort of started as, wouldn't it be great, just the idea, wouldn't it be great if we
Right.
had this? And we started having homebrew parties at members' houses. So
Oh.
basically, the beginning of it was as simple as we brew 10 gallons of beer 1 month, and then we bring that 10 gallons of beer to someone else's house the next month and drink it as we brew the next
So
10
who's
gallons
the
of
we
beer.
brew the beer?
So we basically, put out the word and said, who's interested in this idea of a community-owned brew
Right.
pub? So the first gathering, we maybe had 15 or 20 people show up. And we just brewed and the first one was in my garage, and the second one was in, one of our board members, Peter's garage. And we just sort of had this rotation where we would go from one house to the next each month, and people who were interested and had come to the previous parties would bring their friends, and it just kind of started snowballing.
And some of these folks know how to brew beer, I'm assuming. So
Yes. We had a few we've had a few folks involved in our brewing committee who work for breweries professionally.
Oh, nice.
And then we have kind of a good subset of our members. There's the vast majority of our members don't homebrew; they just like to drink beer. But we have a subset that's very into the home brewing
homebrew.
part.
Yeah.
And so for the first, and under Vermont law, you can the There's a lot of stuff around anything where you're selling beer,
Right.
but it's very simple under the regulatory structure to have a homebrew sampling party.
Okay, good.
So that
Make
kind of
it and drink
became
it, huh?
yeah, that became kind of our outreach tool was, show up at like, a nonprofit or something
Yeah.
with like a couple of kegs of like member homebrew and pour
Yeah.
free beer and have a party and then, do another one of those in a couple months and
Yeah.
and then people wanted to learn to brew could come to our homebrew days and just sort of like learn the
You better
basics.
sign up quick.
I know, right? I gotta sign up
Before
for this.
the end of the show.
So that kind of got the ball rolling, and so then we sort of formally incorporated legally as a co-op in 2015, and kind of continued in that primarily sort of outreach, kind of essentially being a homebrew club that had this vague vision of eventually having our own space.
Right.
And then in the last year or two, it's really kind of gone from that to buckling down, really working on business planning, assessing spaces. We're kind of assessing a space right now that looks very promising. We've hired an engineer to do a study of it to make sure that
nice.
everything's gonna
In
work.
Burlington, I'm assuming, right? Yeah.
And potentially it would be the opportunity to actually purchase the space, which is interesting. And so that's something we've been experimenting actually with yet another spin-off thing like the investment club, but essentially a real estate holding company that would be cooperatively owned that
My
that Full Barrel would be a member of, but that
see.
could kind of like
Yeah.
set the real estate
Yep.
separate from the business, so some investors could come in and
Yep.
have
Right.
their investment
Yeah,
back.
Yeah,
sure,
so
and you can branch out
the
if you
club
want.
doesn't have to
Mhm.
absorb all of the costs of the real
Exactly.
estate. Yeah.
Yep.
What's the liability to the members for their $100, and is there liability if you're borrowing money and building and owning?
So
is there a wall there?
yes,
somehow?
yes. There's a legal wall. So cooperative functionally is very similar in terms of liability to like a C corporation, where it's the liability is limited to the investment they've
Right.
made. Right.
Okay.
There's no sort of pass through on a personal level.
What is that, director and board member insurance?
Insurance?
That's what I
Mhm.
like.
Yeah, exactly.
Whenever I join, I'm like, where's the insurance?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the questions, I guess, is what model is Full Barrel employing for the co-op? Is it a member co-op? Is it a consumer co-op? Is it a
So
worker co-op?
legally, we're a consumer co-op right
Okay.
now, but we're very curious. We've been talking. On this one. This is one of the reasons I was really excited to go on this trip last weekend to visit Three Cross in Worcester, Mass, because I really do like the idea of having kind of both the opportunity for both customers and employees to have a stake in the business.
Have both.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So Vermont doesn't actually have a law that specifically has a separate corporate form for that. There is actually a consumer cooperative corporation under Vermont law, but there's no kind of multi-stakeholder co-op corporation.
Right.
Quebec has something like that, but you can do what they did and essentially sort of custom design a C corp to do that. So we're definitely thinking, for the moment we're consumer owned, but we're definitely thinking about how to potentially make that sort of
So the
half and half
consumer owned
work.
is like you pay $100 a month or whatever.
Or you pay $100 to buy a share.
To buy a share.
You own a share.
And
Okay.
you're on the board, is that, or is there a board above that?
Right. So the members then elect a board of directors.
Oh,
So each
okay.
member share gives them one vote, and then we have a board of directors of 9 members that meets once a
Nice,
month and kind of kind of keeps track of what the committees are doing
Right.
and all of that kind of
A
classic
lot of
board
work
work.
for volunteers.
Yeah, we keep busy,
good.
but we do have, it's the only board I go to where you get there and everyone's like, all right, so now we're opening this beer and everyone gets a little bit, and now we're opening this beer and
Oh,
everyone
I
gets a
wanna
little
be
bit.
on this
Yeah,
board.
I've got to
so
definitely
the
sign
board
up for
meetings
this
aren't
now.
the worst that I've
Yeah.
been part of.
Yeah,
We have
definitely.
fun.
So let me ask you, I'm going to take this. You have to switch back and forth with me.
Okay.
You have 95 members, and you currently are using, this is where you have to explain it to me, 15-gallon system.
So that's kind of in terms of the those homebrew days.
Okay, and then I know you've moved on to vetting a space, but at one point you wanted to acquire a 1-barrel apparatus. What does that mean in the brewing world?
So that's a fairly small
okay.
thing. So
Small
a barrel is
operation.
31 gallons.
Oh,
So
okay.
so we were kind of
but we've gone beyond that now.
Yeah, so we were kind of thinking, we had been looking at a space that was going to be fairly small, about the idea of like, just doing like a little, 500 to 1,000 square feet
Right, okay.
spot. But the space we're looking at has some fairly reinforced floors, and this is one of the things we're exploring with the engineering study we're doing right now, to find out kind of like exactly how
Really
much
big.
weight it can hold.
Right.
Right.
How big of a
Is there a kitchen in this plan? Because you have to have food if you're drinking beer.
We do have to have food, although the spot we're looking at has two BYOB restaurants that
Right
do
on the
carry
side.
out, like right on either side of
So
it.
they can carry it out into the brewery.
Yeah, so we can be overflow seating for them, and yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's
So
great.
that was one of the things that as we've been going is like, okay, the logistics of making beer happen and the logistics of making prepared food
Well,
happen
everybody wins there.
it's difficult.
Yeah.
are difficult. And
Yeah.
so being able to that's one of there's a lot of things that after years of looking, this spot is like really hoping it works out.
Well, who-
Yeah.
That food thing is definitely one of them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and you
I
have to
mean,
be.
seriously.
You have to have something unique, especially in Burlington. I think you have to have something unique because there's so many breweries, and they all have their own
Right.
thing. They all have their own, niche that they bring to the table. So something like this is cool, and I'm interested in it. But to definitely in a town like Burlington, you have to have something that sets you apart.
Right.
And so I'm kind of curious, you buy into it, right? So you put down your $100 to become a member. What does that get you? And you show up at a party once, every couple months, and drink a beer, or what does that?
Yeah, so
look
there's
like?
a few pieces, right? There's the kind of classic financial thing that we were talking about earlier, where just like at City Market or food co-op, if you spent $1,000 and there was a 5% rate of profit, you get $50 back at the end of the year. You get the same thing. You get a rebate at the end of the year for how much you spent at the bar, right? So there's a little financial thing
Yep,
there.
right.
You get a vote for the board of directors, and if you want to, you can run. So the members can have influence over the direction of the business. So if there's big strategic decisions, it's not going to be made without at least you knowing about it.
Right.
We also do kind of about quarterly. We do member assemblies, which is basically like a members only party where folks get together. There's a short meeting opportunity for folks to to weigh in about anything that's going on and receive an update. And then we have some things that as we're going, we've kind of put on that we want to do. So one is kind of having a members tab, where when we do those members assemblies, it's to kind of keep cultivating that community of homebrewers, even after we have a large system
Right.
and a professional brewer doing it. We still want to kind of be very supportive and engaged with that group of folks. And so one thing that we really want to continue with is to do basically, maybe a quarterly homebrew competition. And then the winner of that homebrew competition, their recipe gets brewed on the
bigger-
larger system,
yeah,
and that's
yeah.
on tap
Nice.
for the next quarter.
So who does the members vote on what kind of beers they'd like to see produced?
So that would be just for this kind of like special members tab.
Oh, okay.
So there's definitely some things that you'd want where you want to make sure that the professional brewer who knows the
Right,
market
knows what
and
they're
knows all of
doing.
that. We're not
Right.
just kind of like, all right, this is goofy and interesting, and we're going to make it, but no one's actually going to buy it.
Right,
So
right.
so the plan is to have kind of a core base of of beers that are consistent,
Yep.
some rotating seasonals, and then one or two taps that
Great.
kind of come
'Cause
out
I
of the
told you I
membership.
went to one last night. It must have had 100 selection, and I don't know how they keep it fresh. Because if it's not fresh, you're in trouble. So do you know how do they keep it fresh?
I mean, part of it's just managing your supply chain,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So just making
Knowing
sure that
what's
things
popular.
are coming and being refrigerated the whole way, et cetera.
Because with 100 choices, they're not going to go fast.
Also, different styles definitely have different shelf
Oh,
lives,
ah.
right? So if you're looking at a darker beer versus like a big juicy IPA,
Yeah.
that juicy IPA you're going to want to a couple of weeks, and you're
Right,
going to want to
and
get
out.
it done. Versus like darker beer, you might be able to have sit in a keg for a month or two, and
Yeah.
it's not.
It looks it.
yeah, exactly.
I'm into the wheat stuff that you can sort of that yellow combination there.
Depends
So-
on the time of year,
Yeah,
though.
exactly.
I think
That's true.
it changes. Cool. So, going forward, I mean, you're looking at spaces, right? What's kind of the short-term plan for like the next year, and what's the long-term plan?
So the short-term plan, if this space kind of engineering study comes back, it's all good. Basically, we would be looking to form this entity to potentially purchase it at the beginning of the year, and it currently has a tenant in it who would have basically a a lease that would go for one more year. So once we have it sort of locked down and say, okay, at the end of that lease, then we're going to move in and start going. Then we can really start the business planning. That's not the general like, okay, this is how it would work in a generic setting. We can start going down the rabbit hole of, all right, here's the neighborhood, here's the demographics, here's how much traffic we can expect. Here's how much weight the floor can support, so we can fit this amount of equipment in there,
exciting.
and really sort of dial in, all of those pieces of the puzzle to get ready for that. And then, of course, you make sure that we have the capital sort of ready to go, so when the time comes to be like, all right, fit up equipment, boom, 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 minimize the amount of time that we're in the space not generating revenue, so
Right.
making that transition as fast as possible.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have all the ducks in a row to start. So, so if I, say someone off the street walks into this facility, right? Do they have to be a member to buy a beer there, or is it?
No. Anyone could come in and buy a beer and hang out, but they wouldn't be credited towards their patronage refund at the end of the year.
Right.
And a
Green
few
is
other
green.
things.
It's a good thing.
And there's definitely some of the co-op breweries around that actually do have like members only taps that you have to be a member to get a pour off of.
Right.
So the one I visited in Worcester, that's one of the ones that's house made. But I know of at least one other one where they'll kind of like go hunting for rare kegs and then find it, but then you have to be a member to order off of that keg.
Nice.
So they're
Right.
like, all right, we got this thing. There's one of
Yeah.
them. We put it out on the private listserv, and members come down and get that.
So you get like a membership card or something?
Oh,
like
yeah,
that?
yeah.
Very cool.
It's a proud thing to have.
I know.
We go down to Gettysburg a lot in Pennsylvania, and there's a brewery down there, and their whole ceiling is full of mugs. And you buy a mug. And that $100 would buy me a mug. And there is a waiting list. We're on the waiting list to buy into so we can go in and order, number 250 of the mugs and drink out of our mug. And that's a great way to entice people to.
Yeah,
That's what got us started thinking about
we've been
it.
definitely mulling that idea, and the
great.
thing that came up is like Black Star I think has over 3,000 members now.
Yeah.
And so I was imagining the logistics of having 3,000
3,000 mugs, yeah.
So I was
Well,
like,
this
all right,
doesn't
maybe we'll
have
have like 200, and you come in and scan your card, then they hand you one of the member mugs, but it's a little more generic, right?
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. You don't have a number on your specific mug. Yeah.
So you've been using the slogan, own your beer, which I think is very nice. I like that. I want to own my beer. And your website, I know you have a logo. I don't know if you have a copy of it, but we're going to put it up so they can see. Maybe you could explain how that came to be, the logo.
Oh, yeah,
because
yeah.
It's very
So-
catchy, as people
So
will
again, this
say.
is one of those volunteer things, but we had a member who does professional graphic design and marketing, and so
nice.
so he basically we did a little process where first we went through, we kind of first of all came to our name. And that was one of the first things the group kind of did together as a kind of group democratic exercise.
Right.
So we put out like a series of polls. The first poll was like, all right, everyone has an idea for a name for the brewery, throw it in this Google Doc. So we ended up with like 50-something name descriptions.
Right.
And we were like, all right, everyone vote for your the 10 you most like. And so we got a top 10 and then
Right.
kind of narrowed it down, and Full Barrel was the winner of the process.
I like it.
And so our logo is, some hands have a barrel that's sloshing to the side. But really the idea of, okay, so we're all in this together, and, it's everyone's efforts in different ways that are making
That's
it.
cool.
So we
Well,
have
we'll
a
put
full
up the
barrel of
logo
beer.
now so people can relate to what we're talking about here. So do you have a master plan with the visuals? So if I wanted to see what's going to happen in a couple of years, is there a visual so we can say, ooh, I like that?
So we're not quite there yet in terms of the just because we're not 100% on the particular space.
Oh, okay.
Once we've got that, then sort of the next step would be going forward with our architect
Yeah,
and
right.
doing some renderings and really working on the design. So the space we're looking at is about 3,000 square feet. So it would be it's something where it's going to be moderate size, and the plan is to not do a huge amount of distribution. So from a production capacity perspective, we're going to be looking to sell most of our
They'll
beer
be
from the
outside your
tap
door
room.
like they do with,
Yeah.
what is it, The Alchemist with
Oh, The Alchemist,
Hetty
yeah.
Topper
Yeah.
and Fokelbanger.
Oh, that would be
Wouldn't
lovely.
great, huh?
Exactly.
They come in from out of town.
Put in solar panels over your parking lot.
My husband stands in line. It just blows
Oh, yeah.
my mind.
Well, he's not the only one.
Well,
Well, that
I
was
know,
actually
he's in
one
good
thing we were
company.
looking at was it would have 3,000 square foot of roof space. So if we had
There you go.
maybe a 5-barrel system, we could do it basically, even with the amount of solar power we could expect to get, which would be pretty neat.
That would be pretty neat.
Awesome.
Yeah,
That'd
fully
be
solar
great.
powered beer.
Because brewing is not an energy light process.
No. So if we could have it be fully offset, financially, that could actually look quite nice for us.
So that actually leads right into my next question, which is investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because all this stuff takes investment. So where are you looking to get your seed money for this project? Because is it probably not all coming from the members of the co-op, right?
Right.
You have to get some startup costs from somewhere.
Yeah, so there's a few different pieces of that puzzle, right? So the initial, just kind of the all volunteer group organizing, paying for website hosting and that sort of stuff comes out of that the $100 people have put in, and then once we have our location, we're going to kind of do more of a place-based push to get more members in. But realistically, before we open, I wouldn't expect us to have more than a few hundred members. So that's going to be like a small chunk from the common share memberships.
Right.
And we sort of went back and forth about the price of that share, but decided on $100 because we wanted to err on the side of kind of having more people be members.
That's reasonably affordable. I mean, for most, I would think.
But then, so there's a few pieces of the puzzle. The first, and this is what would be coming up soon if the space works, is forming this real estate investment co-op essentially that would purchase the space. And so we have a number of members who basically said, okay, because this is backed by real estate, and if the full barrel thing doesn't work out, we would at least get our money back,
Right,
maybe even
right.
have a little profit on top of it. They're willing to put a significant amount in there. And then two important players, and this is not just for full barrel, but in the kind of co-op development ecosystem generally in Vermont and in New England, are the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a community development financial institution loan fund that was originally founded in the 70s by some of the food co-ops pooling their surplus, but has actually grown and has about 30 million in assets now total.
Oh, wow.
And so it exists
Sign me
sort
up.
of specifically in a specialized way to invest in cooperatives.
And where is that located at? Because I haven't. The name doesn't ring a bell.
So they have it's kind of virtual. So there's folks throughout the but actually the local rep for our part of New England is headquartered. They live in Barrie.
Oh,
So
no
it's,
kidding! Right? Why haven't I heard
Right
this?
up the street.
Yes,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
I better.
Well, it's not like they have an office.
Well,
right?
I mean,
So-
this kind of seems like if you're a co-op investment organization, this kind of seems like a slam dunk, right? It's a brewery in Vermont, co-op.
Yeah, if we have
like
a
what
solid
more do
business
you need
plan,
to
all
know?
that,
Yeah.
The other player that's newer on the scene, but I'm watching closely, is actually, I mentioned earlier, VSECU.
Yep.
Because it was recently discovered that Vermont was one of 8 states that allows state-chartered credit unions to make equity investments in other co-ops specifically.
Oh.
And so they've created a fund to sort of that would specifically
Be
do
sure
equity.
to vote
in-
on that question.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that fund is existing now. They call it Co-op Capital, and the rule is for projects they're willing to do up to like $145,000 per project. So if it's so looking at kind of how these things fit together, you get sort of that member common equity. You can issue those non-voting preferred shares to members who want to put in more than the $100. And if it sort of depends on if we're going to do that as a public thing or as one of those like more closely held things. If it's a few people or a lot of people, we're still kind of on the fence about which approach, because there's regulatory things around that. Securities law is something I've had to learn a lot about in the last year or two as I've been looking into this.
Yeah, putting in your volunteer hours.
Yep,
Right.
yep. But and then looking to maybe Co-op Capital as a source of some of that equity, and then the Cooperative Fund of New England would be providing debt. So that's kind of
Gotcha.
the capital stack, as you were.
Excellent.
And all of these folks are on board at this point, or?
Well, I mean, it's obviously something where no one's like made a sign
Sign
on the dotted
anything.
line,
Yeah, but they're
line
interested.
commitment. But yes, and, so I've been having conversations with them every 4 to 6 months to like check in. Here's where we're at now. So they're following along and are in conversation, and
Very cool.
this is the sort of thing that they exist to do. So if we can bring a good business plan to the table where the numbers work,
Yeah,
I'm
and they
quite
have to
hopeful.
do that. Do you have somebody besides yourself that can help you? Because you need a marketing plan, you need a business plan, you need
Yeah, no,
the pictures and all the
we-
visuals.
We have a pretty solid bench on our board of directors and some other volunteers. So the board vice president, I'm the board president. The board vice president is actually in there's a program that's, I think, the only of its kind in North America that's actually like an MBA, but specifically for cooperatives.
Oh,
Yes.
So
really?
it's like Masters of Management of Cooperatives and Credit Unions.
At where, at UVM or something?
No, it's
or-
actually, it's a remote program out of Nova Scotia.
Oh, right.
So he's been kind of, this project has almost been an opportunity for him to do a lot of coursework.
sure.
essentially.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
oh,
Right through.
I need a case study. Here we go. Do.
Yeah.
So he's been
Great.
fantastic to have on the
I'm
case.
sure,
And
yeah.
there's folks with marketing backgrounds, and we have someone who's a professional brewer who can assess the
Sounds like you got a really
equipment needs
diverse
and all
group of
that.
people that are really able to dive in. And
Yeah, we're really lucky, and I've definitely been on a variety of boards over the years, and it's one of the more high functioning ones, even if we are kind of getting
Well,
a
if you
little
haven't-
sloshy towards the end of our meetings.
if you're having fun with it, right? That's
so
that's
cool.
what matters.
Nobody's
Yeah.
getting that beer belly.
Yeah,
huh? You have to watch
every once
them.
in a
I've
while.
only been on the board.
Yeah.
I had to break out the
So
exercise
I got a
bike.
really stupid, maybe a girl question, because I don't understand. You've got the vats for beers, but it's all done in the vat by adding product, right? Like
So-
hops.
So basically,
I have no idea, no
You
laughing.
need to do some brewery tours.
No, I
This is-
know, but I bet there's somebody out there that doesn't
the
know
simplest
like me.
way to describe, and this is how you make most alcohol, right, is you have yeast. Yeast are these
Yeast,
friendly
right.
guys who co-evolved with us in various ways.
Right.
And some people argue are the foundation of civilization. People became sedentary because if they stayed long enough for something to ferment, they could get them drunk. And
Oh,
so,
well, there you go.
so then you form civilizations out of that, right?
You stay in one place
Our
long enough.
civilization-
I say that only
Help.
half jokingly. Like I think that's probably a factor in the whole thing.
Probably a factor.
But yeah, so you basically like feed the yeast sugar, and then they poop out alcohol, and
Yeah.
boom, you have that. So the
But
different
there's different kinds. There's like
Exactly,
the
so
really,
the- so it
really
depends
bitter,
on-
thick stuff you can't
on
see
what kind
through.
of sugar you feed them, right? So if you're making
What do you
wine,
mean?
you're feeding them sugar from grapes. If you're making cider, you're feeding them sugar from apples. If you're making beer, you're feeding them sugar from malted grains, right?
Excellent.
So-
Don't say right to me because I have no clue. But I'm listening.
do now.
I'm
So that's the
paying
difference between a
attention.
wheat
Or for
beer
instance,
and
Yeah,
a,
where does my wheat beer come from? Because that's
Yeah,
what I
so
like.
that would be malted wheat,
Right.
and some malted wheat, but also some malted barley. Because if you just make a beer with malted wheat, wheat is pretty high protein, and so that's going to have certain characteristics. So wheat is kind of like, if in a wheat beer, it's maybe like a quarter or less
Oh,
of
I
the
see,
total
I see.
grains will be
Right.
wheat. But so when you're making a beer, you take these different kinds of grains and combine them to make different styles.
So an IPA, what is that different? That's all my husband lives for is IPA or double IPA. So what is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's
about?
going to be, again, so you can use, there's lots of different subtle combinations, but you're
Right.
going to be looking at, again, sort of a base of, just sort of barley and some
Okay.
kind of like pale malt.
And it's
but-
all done in the
So you
vat?
basically, you take the vat, you heat up some water, you run the water through the hot water through this malted grain, and the
Right.
malting process, right, is where they like sprout it and then kind of like put it in a kiln.
Right.
And so that's what
Oh.
lets you access the sugar from the grain. So you're running the hot water through the grain, you're essentially sort of like washing the sugar out of the grain. And then you use that sugar
Oh,
water,
right, that
you
makes
boil the
sense.
hops in it to add the bitterness and the flavors and aromas that come from the hops, and then cool it down, and then you put it in a container, and then that's when we add our yeast friends, and they eat up all the sugar,
Yes,
and
right.
you see the carbon dioxide spraying out of the airlock if you're home brewing, and then after a certain
Cool.
amount of time, the alcohol level comes up to the point where they stop fermenting, and different
What's
varieties
the,
of
what's
yeast.
the alcohol level here in Vermont? I mean, they must have a certain percentage,
well,
right?
it depends on the type of yeast you're using and how much yeast you
So
apply.
what's
Right.
the max of?
Well, so it used to be that anything. Actually, this was a law change maybe like 5 or 10 years ago. It used to be
Relatively
like you could do up to 8%, and that counted as beer. And if it went
Oh.
above 8%, it was like something else.
Oh.
Which is why a lot of things like Heady Topper are like 8%. Now they've changed it, so it's now you can go higher.
I think it's like 12 or something
Oh,
now,
really?
something
Oh,
like
wow.
that.
Right, but yeah, essentially it's there's certain kinds of yeast. So for instance, champagne yeast. If you're wanting to make a really strong like mead or cider or something,
Right.
you can keep feeding the champagne yeast sugar and it'll go up to 15, 16, 18%
Wow.
alcohol. Whereas there's others where it's like you just want a simple ale, it'll go up to 4 or 5, and
Yeah.
so your
It's
choice
good
of
I'm
yeast
here
is
to ask these questions
Yeah.
because there's people out there.
I'm sure
that
there's people
don't
out there that
know.
want to. Yeah, but it's all in like the stock that you're using. It's all in the type of yeast you're using, how much yeast you apply. You
right.
know.
Yeah, it's playing with some chemistry and some biology and
There's a whole lot of things that at
making
play.
a delicate recipe. And then you can do different adjuncts. So one that I kind of enjoyed is we made a wheat beer that we harvested a bunch and dried out a bunch of red clover flowers. So rather than just water, we used the tea we made out of the red clover as the base, and then did that. And that added a nice subtle both color and taste.
Yeah, and that's where you get a lot of your citrus too, because you kind of almost steep whatever your citrus base is to make a tea sort of thing, and then
exactly.
And that's
we were talking before the program. I mean, the thing on grapefruit is everywhere these days. That's the Heady Topper and the Focal Banger has that grapey
There's
taste.
like sculpins and things like that. They've used it. One other thing that's kind of been on the rise, and that was one of the things I encountered on our trip, was ginger beer.
Yeah.
And so Artisan Beverage Co-op in Greenfield, Mass. was one of the first ones to sort of do alcoholic ginger beer, and they have something that's available up here called Ginger Libation. But when I was down there, they had a bunch of them.
Because real ginger's got a tang
it's
to
a little
it.
spicy.
Wake you right up.
Yeah. And so for them, it's they use cane sugar to ferment, and so it's like the cane sugar's the base. They have like ginger and lime juice, and it's pretty tasty. I was happy we stopped at that.
Yeah.
While we're driving.
Is that one of the next big things? Because it seems like the last 2 years has been IPAs, right? And I think people are starting to diversify away from IPAs maybe now. But what do you think the next big beer craze is going to be?
I personally I think that I think we might already be starting to see it, but I think there's going to be a reaction against the sort of going to the really high ABVs, like the 8.
What's that?
Sorry, alcohol by volume.
The
I like
that.
The 8 and 9% ones. I think that I think there's a lot of more subtle stuff you can do with things that are in the 3 to 4% range. And we've started to see that in some sours, right? So some of the sours that are coming out are in that range. And I think that for a variety of reasons, where it's okay, well, rather than just having one and done with a Heady Topper, having something where you can have 2 or 3 that are more that you can kind of play more with the flavors.
Right.
So I'm curious to see how that plays out, but I think there's space there that's not.
Well, and from a brewery perspective too, that's probably better business to have it at the 3 or 4 range, because then you buy 2 of them as opposed to one.
Although there is some interesting stuff with because it's taxed, the way it's taxed is as an excise tax by volume.
Right.
So not by alcohol content.
Interesting.
So in some ways, from almost I don't know, a tax efficiency standpoint. There is a little bit of an incentive to go higher.
Interesting.
But there's also sort of, especially for smaller breweries, the excise tax is much lower.
Right.
So I think that for that sort of experimentation, there's maybe a built-in advantage for if you're doing a few thousand barrels versus hundreds of thousands of barrels.
Right.
It's not as big of a difference for
a Heady Topper, or like a Alchemist, or a Long Trail, or a Switchback, or Magic Hat. One of those guys they're playing a different game.
I can't even imagine how many actual beers there are available.
Oh, there's
it
hundreds
goes
and hundreds
forever,
of them.
ever. How do you pick?
Well, it's sort of amazing to think about because that at the low point there was, I think, less than 60 breweries in the country.
Oh, really?
Because it was the way the regulatory and legal structure worked, post-prohibition. It was just you're creating a commodity.
Right.
And honestly, it's sort of fascinating to watch with the parallels between the sort of homebrewing scene that emerged in the 1970s before homebrewing was legalized.
Right.
So homebrewing was illegal up until I think it was Jimmy Carter made it sort of set up the thing where it was okay, you can do anyone can brew up to 200
Jimmy Carter
gallons.
did that? He never drank.
Right?
He didn't drink in the White House. What's up with that?
Yeah, he legalized homebrewing.
All right, thank you,
Jimmy.
But
it was that sort of homebrewing scene that built up the sort of skills that allowed then the craft brewers to then kind of come out of the shadows in a way.
Yeah.
Right.
And say, okay, now we can
practice at home.
I can do it. It's not just and originally it was in the very early days it was often you would order something from England that would just be a can where it was malt syrup with the hops put in it, and you just pour it into a thing, boil it for a little while, and boom, that's your beer.
Wow.
Right. So that was the beginnings, but so in some ways it's been interesting to watch as Vermont has moved towards cannabis legalization.
Yeah.
There's a very similar kind of skill flow that's been happening that I feel very much parallels the sort of early days of craft beer.
Right.
Because you have this sort of thing where it's this legal gray area where people sort of build the skills, and then when sort of a market opens up, who has the skills are the people who can kind of actually move into the market there. So it's kind of an interesting parallel
I'm sure
historically.
a really good brewmaster is a hot commodity, right? everybody wants them and willing to pay. So sort of like the wine connoisseur.
Right.
Nice.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, you've been educating folks. You've got a conference. I don't know if that's your first conference you did back in June this year.
Oh no, so the
This
Vermont
is one
Employee
of many?
Ownership Center. Yeah,
Yeah.
we do an employee ownership conference every year.
Oh,
So this
okay,
this year
so-
it's June 8th. So it's like this will be like the 17th or something. And that brings together people from the ESOP companies, the worker
Oh, I
co-op
see,
companies.
okay.
Yeah.
And do you talk about the beer? And I mean, because everything you're involved in sort of supports each other.
Yeah, no, I
so
mean
it
that's
all
one of the
fits
things
in.
where, again, there's several of those co-ops I visited down in Massachusetts are organized on that worker co-op basis. So that question of so for these kinds of
Yeah.
companies, how do you create spaces for people to meet
Right.
each other and learn from each other? And one of my hopes for Full Barrel is that it can really sort of provide that like a nice community third place in Burlington for
Nice.
people who are interested in the model, interested in good beer, interested in a place where
I
we
think
can.
it'll take off here. I
Oh,
really
yeah.
do. I mean,
Absolutely.
and I'm surprised there's only, what'd you say, 50 employee-owned cooperatives in Vermont.
Well, so
Is that
the
what you-
co-ops and the
That surprised
ESOPs.
me.
but-
I thought it would be more than that, just because we're a very entrepreneur people. And I was trying to remember the Entrepreneurs Center in Burlington. The guy who runs it, we did a show about there, but it's a place in Burlington where
You think of
somebody,
like the generator or
yeah, something like that, and it's the coolest place because it's all funky,
Mm-hmm.
and people can go and get help setting up a business and an entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a
setting.
lot of talk about sort of accelerators and things like
Right,
that
right.
in the startup world over the past few years. And actually, so one of the people who I met when we were down in Boston was involved with starting the first co-op accelerator in North America.
Oh, really?
So it's called Start.coop. They have their first cohort. The way these things tend to work is they'll get like a group of entrepreneurs. They'll give them a little bit of investment capital. They'll hook them up with mentors.
Right, that's what
really
this
sort
one
of
does.
trying to set it
Yeah,
up for
right.
success.
So almost like the angel investment, like
Yeah.
seed capital. Type
Right.
thing,
So
yeah.
so this one's called Start.coop, and they have their first cohort of 6 or 7, and it's like okay, each of them gets $10,000, and then they each get a mentor, and then they have certain like kind of classes they get together to all work on like the same piece of their projects, and they're in different fields, but it's that sort
great.
of building that sort of infrastructure that can help bring these new businesses into
Is this
existence.
craft beer good for our farmers must be benefiting from this if they're growing the wheat crops and the different crops, so that's a boon to the agricultural business too.
I mean,
I would
the
think.
grain is fairly limited in Vermont, although there is now I think Peterson's malts is now up and running, and they're the first maltster in Vermont in like 50 years or something like that.
Right.
Oh, really?
So some of the breweries are now able to use kind of Vermont and at least regionally grown grains.
Right.
Vermont used to actually be one of the biggest hop producing regions in the country. Up until Vermont actually started prohibition in the 1850s, and so at that point, like it sort of went into decline. And then the other thing was the Pacific Northwest came online, which is the only place in the world where you can have 2 crops in a single season with hops. So it's very optimal. But nonetheless, Vermont's still actually a fairly solid place to grow certain varieties of hops, and you can still sort of find, essentially feral varieties
Right.
occasionally that like go back to when it was a hop growing region. So I've got some on my back deck and a number of our other members. So
Oh, cool.
in,
Well, 'cause I
in the
would think
fall
they'd
we'll do
want
like
to jump in on that.
a wet hop brew day where there's a certain kind of beer you can make, but usually you dry them out because otherwise you will get this kind of vegetative taste. But there's a certain variety of beer where it kind of goes for that vegetative taste, and you just pick the cones straight
You are
off.
so
and
excited
throw 'em in
about
there.
this. I love talking to
I
you.
love
It's
it.
really, you're getting me all yacked up here. That's great. Yeah, because I would think our farmers, because they keep looking how to diversify.
I got to imagine this is going to turn into a cash crop here in
Yeah, for
Vermont.
sure.
Yeah.
Because there's so much supply. That
I think the
demand
one
for
thing on the
supply.
hop side is that because of like how wet we are, there can be this like there's certain pests and mildews and things that
Oh.
can happen. So UVM definitely has a program in their ag college
Right,
that they're
right.
doing research and testing different things, and they have basically an experimental hop yard where they so you can
Nice.
actually go on their website and find when things have gone to are like optimal for harvest over the past 10 years, and they're really sort of building some data on this, which is great.
Very cool.
Very nice. So we have a few minutes left, Matt. Is there anything that we haven't touched on? Certainly anything you wanted to talk about that we've forgotten to ask.
Oh, well, I'll just say if folks are interested in learning more, our website is fullbarrel.coop. And you can find sort of a membership forum and some other info. And also on Facebook, we always post our events. We usually do some sort of event that we're going to do, probably a Learn to Brew Day kind of right before New Year's for folks who are on vacation and looking for something to do and hang out. And we do other things.
Where
just
would
as a
you have
group.
that event?
We usually do those at a member's house.
Oh,
So-
really?
So it's just basically like someone who's got a homebrew system will
Right, nice.
we'll roll it out into their garage.
Then I think we should
pop a
go
few
on a
beers
field
and-
trip.
I think maybe we should.
Well, look for it. We could bring a camera and there you go.
But for anyone who's interested in learning how to homebrew and doesn't want to get their kitchen sticky, not knowing what they're doing without
Right.
someone who does know what they're doing, these days are great chance to try it out.
That's great. Well, your enthusiasm, I'm sure you'll be successful. Matt, thank you very much for joining us. Thank
Thank
you
you so
for
much.
tuning in.
Yeah, thanks so much
We
for having
really
me.
appreciate it. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.